Good morning, everyone, and welcome. In recent times, George, Ahmad, Christian Cooper, and so many more represent why we protest. George, an unarmed Black man, was arrested because a grocery store thought he was signing a bad check, basically for forgery. However, George, unarmed, was violently arrested by the Minneapolis police. He was pinned to the ground by an officer who knelt on his neck. He begged for water, begged for air, and was ignored until he died. I cannot go on with today's webinar without using this space to honor his life and the lives of other fallen Black men and women. Rest easy, George Floyd. My name is Umenwaliri, and I am the Associate Director of the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I will be moderating this session. Thank you for joining us as we discuss the COVID-19 pandemic and what it means for development. Today's webinar is focused on the impact of COVID-19 on development work in Africa. We're looking specifically at status, challenges, and opportunities. This webinar is in partnership with the African Studies Center at UNC Chapel Hill and iDev-Africa. iDev-Africa is a development consulting firm championing innovative approaches to Africa's development. We focus on delivering practical and innovative solutions to real-life problems using systems thinking, technology, and community involvement. You can follow iDev on LinkedIn at iDev-Africa or Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at iDev-Africa20. Thank you to our expert panelists for accepting to participate in this discussion despite your busy schedules. I appreciate your generosity. Now, the question we're trying to answer today is still unraveling and fast changing. However, as the situation evolves, experts continue to dig in to understand what it means for now and for the future. What is development work? Simply put, it means identifying problems that affect the daily lives of people and solving them. Through research and aid, development work in Africa supports activities that have social and economic benefits for African governments and its people. Since the announcement of Sub-Saharan Africa's first COVID-19 confirmed case in Nigeria in late February, governments responded by shutting down economies and instituting stay-at-home orders. This pandemic has caused unprecedented global economic and social crisis, revealing again deep inequalities and vulnerabilities. Our first speaker, Larry Umunna, can shed some light on the timeliness and urgency for local solutions in development work. Larry is TechnoServe's Regional Director for West Africa. He's tasked with mobilizing public and private sector investments for TechnoServe's West Africa programs in agriculture, food processing, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and sustainable livelihood. Thank you, Larry, for honoring my invitation. I have two questions for you. The first is, can you share with us how COVID-19 is affecting TechnoServe's programming on a continent level? And specifically, how, if any, you are adjusting and relying more on local solutions? My second question, and the reason I'm asking these questions together, just so we can maximize time. The second question is a fallout of the local capacity and solution question, which is your first question. So as part of the top management of one of the leading consulting and project development firms, what skills, especially now, are critical when recruiting staff for your projects?
Thank you so much, Ada. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Can you hear me? Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And Ada, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I think it will be useful for me to first provide an overview of TechnoServe, who we are, what we do, and the kind of programs we implement before delving into the question proper. For those of you who may not know TechnoServe, we are an international non-profit organization. We've been around for 50 years, operating in 29 countries, headquarters in Washington, DC. I'm based in Abuja, Nigeria, and from here I support our country teams in the West African region to implement our projects and achieve our desired impact. What kind of impacts do we look out for? Is increased income for smallholder farmers and entrepreneurs, improved business opportunities for food processing companies, and sustainable, and supporting them in their sustainable sourcing strategy. TechnoServe works with enterprising men and women in the developing world to build competitive farms, competitive businesses, and competitive industries. And so in our agricultural portfolio, we would help smallholder farmers to grow high-value crops that would help them earn greater incomes. We provide good agronomic practices to them. We teach them farming as a business, create access to finance and access to markets for those farmers. In our entrepreneurship portfolio, typically we would help young entrepreneurs in Africa to start new businesses. We would support established enterprises to accelerate their growth and impact. We would also work with food processors in Africa to expand their businesses and source more products from smallholder farmers. And we would also help small shop owners to improve their businesses and profits. And all these activities are done by the 1,200 people globally, 1,200 employees of TechnoServe on board to assist us in providing tailored technical assistance to farmers, to businesses, and to entrepreneurs. It's important to stress that 90%, 90, of our employees are host country nationals. So they are people that we employ in their countries of origin, working in the field and helping us deliver our programs. These staff combine their business expertise with local knowledge, which is extremely very important, with the relationships that they have in the communities where we work, and with a clear understanding of the context and the environment, which is required to help hardworking men and women in these communities to generate jobs, generate incomes, and create wealth for their families and communities. And so you can imagine when COVID-19 came, extremely very unexpected, unprecedented, shocking for everyone, including donors, implementing partners like us, governments, businesses. We were very concerned about the impact of COVID-19 on densely populated urban areas where we work. For example, Lagos, 21 million people in Lagos alone. Mumbai, 18 million people. As well as, so we're concerned about those densely populated areas, but we were also worried about the major disruptions in smallholder farming communities and the impact it would also have on the SMEs, on small medium enterprises, due to the restrictions on mobility and travels. Social distancing, that word, those two words, social distancing, are actually strange phenomenons for many Africans. In Africa, we like to shake hands, we like to hug. And so we were worried about how do you really implement social distancing in programming. We were worried about the loss of income for these smallholder farmers and these entrepreneurs. We know that an estimated 500 million smallholder farmers around the world live on less than $2 per day. And losing such a significant share of their income threatens their ability to both weather the crisis and participate in the recovery. Of course, our first priority was to protect our employees. Our employees are our greatest asset. And so we wanted to ensure that our employees clearly understood the magnitude of the problem, and we shared information on how to prevent the spread of the virus. We were also concerned about our beneficiaries and our partners as well. And so we developed policies and guidelines for our country offices. We made sure that they had PPEs both for field work and for the staff. And we had to develop guidelines for reopening offices in countries where offices were closed down due to lockdowns, and also guidelines for working on the field. But it was also important for us to develop contingency plans for the projects. And this of course, was one of the things that the COVID-19 helped us to do a critical review of the work plans, to have remember our obligations and commitments to our donors, to do a honest appraisal of our ability to implement these projects, depending on the severity of the government measures, for example, lockdown or ban on interstate travels. We shared these plans with our donors, and the donors appreciated it because it was definitely a clear demonstration of openness in the way we work. But we also have to be strategic in our approach in dealing with this situation. And so based on surveys of 22 TechnoServe agricultural programs in 13 countries across Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, we identified a set of common challenges to protecting rural incomes, nutrition, and food security. And we worked with our program leaders all over the world to develop approaches to help our farmers overcome these obstacles. We also developed similar approaches for entrepreneurs and our food processors, but because of time constraints, I will focus on the agricultural surveys and the approaches that came out of there. But we also identified what challenges were we going to face and would our farmers face. And some of these challenges included market access disruptions, closing of markets, restricted movements of buyers and aggregators. Price volatility was a big issue. Well, there were also disruptions to transports and logistics and last mile distribution. There were issues around disruptions to access to finance. And of course, disruptions to our own ability to deliver technical assistance. And so some of the specific actions that we took varied from country to country and sector to sector, but we could actually categorize them in 3 phases: response, recovery, and resilience. And by response, we're talking about how do we respond to the pandemic at this point in time? How do we help our smallholder farmers withstand these immediate threats to their incomes? How do we aid farming households to keep their agricultural businesses afloat during this crisis? And that's what I will concentrate on in this conversation. So for example, we have farmers who rely on inputs, high quality inputs, very critical to the achievement of good yields on the farm. And so for those farmers who relied on that and relied on services and non-farming labor, restrictions on travel and transportation made it difficult for them to access these critical inputs and services. And in these cases, our teams were focused on coordinating with government authorities, private sector stakeholders, and farmer producer organizations to ensure that these resources were exempted from the restriction. And and we also helped identify alternative arrangements and channels through which this can be assessed. For example, in Nigeria, we helped to facilitate the secure of passes for service providers and for input supplies to projects. We also found what COVID-19 also did, the restrictions made it difficult for our program staff, government extension officers, and other support personnel to deliver in-person training and advising, which is part of what we do. And this, of course, we thought could have negative impact on productivity and crop quality. And so what our teams did was to develop remote advisory strategy, taking into account the type of technology that women and men farmers are able to access. So we created things like WhatsApp groups that included the program staff, the local extension agents, the lead farmers, training participants. And in situations or cases where farmers who don't have phones with access to WhatsApp, the program enlisted family members to serve as intermediaries. And the programs then had to share training material, market information, and other useful information with the farmers. The good thing about this also was the group now has become a network in which farmers are able to sell their other crops and products amongst themselves. We also found in some of our programs that we could use a variety of methods, including WhatsApp videos. Now every program person in TechnoServe is being taught on how to create videos, 2-3 minute videos, text messages, phone calls, radio programs, and community-based intermediaries. And in all of these cases, it was important to keep the content and messaging even clearer and simpler than it would have been if it was delivered in person. In some countries where there were no lockdowns, e.g. Republic of Benin or in Cote d'Ivoire, training of our smallholder farmers and entrepreneurs continued. We however had to reduce the size of the participants to comply with social distancing regulations, not more than 20 in a class, instead of sizes of about 40 or 50, which meant that it took much longer to deliver the contents to our beneficiaries. The other thing I would like to also bring out here is that it was important for us to understand that in difficult situations like this, there's sometimes significant gender gap. Women tend to get the brunt of difficult periods such as pandemics. And so our program, and TechnoServe is an organization that is very, very focused on women, on gender equality, gender empowerment, very important to us. And so we have to understand which communication channels women and men could access, and ensure that we design outreach strategies around these existing channels to ensure that women and men farmers continue to access agricultural advice. We also have to help address the disruptions to the small businesses that farmers depend on to get their crops to the market. And this is particularly important for crops that are perishable. And we wanted to remember, for us, it was about protecting the incomes of smallholder farmers. And so we know that farmers are impacted when aggregators and food processors and exporters face business and operational challenges. And so for this reason, it was important for us to provide these businesses support and advice on how to adapt. And we have examples, for example, in Zimbabwe, where farmers in a horticultural program were critically reliant on the capability of pack houses to quickly package and export products. Social distancing regulations meant they could only have 20% of their staff working at any point in time. And what did our team do? Our team worked with a private sector pack house operator to adapt and operate in shifts of about 24 hours to set up temporary pack houses close to the farmer's field to alleviate this bottleneck. There are other examples of things that we did around access to finance, ensuring that we provided support to farmers and entrepreneurs on how to access various economic stimulus packages that were provided by the respective countries. And we know that crowdfunding companies, donors, there was a lot happening. It's quite cumbersome. We're not too sure how many of them have been able to get this, but that's a different topic entirely. But we have also seen an emergence of lots of digital marketplaces. And so TechnoServe is currently increasing its engagement with young, innovative entrepreneurs to develop and scale up digital marketplaces. We're talking about digital marketplaces where you have orders from processors, engagement with farmers, aggregators, transporters and logistics, online payment systems, everything done online. This may, after all, be the new normal that we are talking about. And so there are lots of examples I can give, but 10 minutes is not sufficient for me to do all of that. For us, COVID-19 created an opportunity for TechnoServe to rethink how we deliver our programs using technology. It made us adapt much more faster and much quicker. It also made us ensure that in whatever we're doing, we need to take recovery and resilience into consideration as we move into the post-COVID era. On the second question as to what kind of skills we would be looking out for when recruiting, generally at TechnoServe, we would have agriculturists, we would have project managers, strategy consultants, business advisors, food technologists, finance specialists, marketing specialists. What is important for us is that we recruit people who will appreciate that it is not business as usual. We need young, sharp, intelligent young men and women who are able to think global, think local as well, and act local. We look for people who are result-oriented, who are innovative, who can think out of the box and come up with practical, affordable, scalable, and sustainable business solutions. And so we're forever looking for highly motivated individuals, detail-oriented people with strong organizational, analytical, research, and quantitative skills. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Larry. It's interesting that TechnoServe is looking at what the technological solutions are, and I definitely think that it's an opportunity for young people to participate. I'm going to introduce Ms. Ahunna Eziakonwa. Ahunna Eziakonwa is the Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa. She's the right person to shed some light on the situation. As I was saying before, Achim Steiner, Administrator of the UNDP, is quoted as saying, the pandemic is a health crisis, but not just a health crisis. For vast swaths of the globe, the pandemic will leave deep, deep scars. Adding that, without support from the international community, we risk a massive reversal of gains made over the last 2 decades and an entire generation lost, if not lost in lives, then in rights, opportunities, and dignity. Ms. Eziakonwa, in her role, leads UNDP's work, supporting 46 countries in Africa to achieve Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Welcome, Ms. Eziakonwa. It's a privilege to have you on this platform. I will be asking you 2 questions, and I will just mention the 2 questions right now, and you can determine how to respond. The first is, please share with us UNDP's response to COVID-19 in Africa, specifically how Africans and its citizens, private sector, and NGOs can support. The second question is, you speak passionately about Africa's dependence on aid and the need to change this. What is your view on how COVID-19 will affect the size of foreign aid? And what post-COVID-19 reconstruction priorities do you envisage? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ada, for having me, and greetings to the panelists on this call. Let me first maybe say something about UNDP. UNDP is a networked organization covering the globe practically. We specialize in having a country presence and also regional presence. So accompanying countries, as Ada was saying, through their development journey. And one of the flagship publications of UNDP is called the Human Development Report, which really checks the health of nations by measuring quality of education and other services that people need to actualize that human dignity that the administrator spoke about. And we just did a recent report that looks at the impact of COVID-19 on human development, and we indeed are saying that we're seeing the greatest reversal in human development in our generation that we know of, and also the fact that this reversal it's coming to Africa at a time when I would say we were looking at Africa as a promise rather than a problem. And this is actually in UNDP Africa, we have talked a lot about Africa's promise, about looking at opportunities of transformation and changing the lens with which we look at the continent. And let's remind ourselves, before this crisis hit, this continent was emerging, some would say rising. And there were lots of good light, a lot of good light, a lot of islands of hope that we were seeing on the continent, the signing of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the emergence of youth industrialists. The previous speaker spoke about digital technology and the fourth industrial revolution and the kind of gains that we were seeing on the continent. So we were moving on Africa with a lot of enthusiasm, energy as the next destination of development progress, and indeed the future of development on the continent, not to talk of the incredible youth population that is much more enlightened, much more connected, that we're seeing, so talented and creative. So all of this energy was there, and then bang, we had COVID-19. What did that do to the confidence of Africa? I would say actually what was projected is not what's happened, that African countries moved quite swiftly to deal with this disease. And it is very much in line with that spirit of Africa emerging. We saw country after country, despite pre-existing conditions that they were all facing, whether you're talking about Burkina Faso, Cameroon, or CAR, despite all of those incredibly difficult conditions of crisis, of fragility, of climate impact, they were still recovering from. We saw African leaders rise to the occasion of trying to ensure that this crisis does not overwhelm their systems. So from the epidemiological side, we know that the apocalyptic projections have not really materialized. Yes, numbers are going up in some countries, but we're not seeing the same level of impact that we've seen around the world. And that you can explain away whichever way you want, but I really put it to the fact that there's been swift leadership on the continent, both by countries, but also by the regional level. The African Union, which has learned a great deal from the Ebola days, but also the resilience of the people. We've seen private sector emerge, coming together and networking and trying to transform. One of the things that got cut off from Africa at the onset was supply chains, importation of supplies, medical supplies to deal with this disease. We know that the continent has to import more than 70% of what it uses to fight diseases that are common on the continent. So this hit Africa so hard. And you saw companies immediately begin to repurpose to produce some of these things locally. We saw startups, young businesses coming up. You've seen these in Senegal, in South Africa, in Ethiopia. You saw technology being unleashed, 3D printing of masks. In fact, in Nigeria, where I come from, the masks turned into fashion, and you saw local tailors, go to work. So the response itself to COVID on the continent, I don't think we should lose sight of how it has brought out Africa's competence, Africa's confidence, and Africa's solidarity. And that needs to be then built into the future of how we get back better. And this is how UNDP is actually processing this. We want to cheat this crisis and not waste it. How do we cheat COVID-19? We cheat it by building back better. So we have a back to better agenda, which includes a number of things. One is how we leverage digital solutions and digital economies. And in Africa, we already see, as I said earlier, a lot of green shoots coming up on this. You see in Kenya with digital finance, fintech companies rising. How do we transform that? That builds on equity, fighting inequality, because once we can have unbanked Africa integrated into the digital finance, we will be talking business. Digitalization of registration. One of the issues with Africa today in terms of social protection, which is minimal, but addressing the economic impact of this, is the absence of that formal sector. Much of the continent is informal, vulnerable and informal businesses. So how do we deploy digital IDs so that people are counted? Because once they're counted, then you can service them. Today, African countries will struggle to address the needs of those in the informal sector because they're not counted. So digital can support us in that. And we're working with several governments to do this. Digital applied to governance. UNDP has a pillar of work on governance. We believe that is foundational to development. And one thing that has come out clear in the COVID response is the importance of transformative and compassionate leadership. And the leaders in Africa that will be sustained have distinguished themselves in the way they have come out and protected their people. So we're looking at governance. How do we support African governments to govern with compassion and to continue to govern in this world, this new normal? And UNDP has been deploying some support in this area, coming up with business continuity plans and strategies for governments, including the virtual governance that is required. But we talk about e-governance, and I talk to the tech companies here. Very important if we're going to fight corruption, if we're going to fight inequality, that we look at e-services, e-governance, e-justice, and all the aspects related to democratic governance that can be, again, supported. And I think maybe a word on finance, financing for development, which starts to touch on your second question. We believe in UNDP that there are actually a lot of resources on the continent. Africa is not a poor continent. We need to mine these resources, and COVID-19 is a rude awakening for that. What is happening to Africa's resources? Where is it sitting? Whether idle or being actively utilized elsewhere, this is time for leaders to come together and pull back those resources for Africa's development, first of all. So domestic resource mobilization, looking at the resources that we have on the continent, looking at the leakages that currently exist, whether it's in the area of illicit financial flows, and really pulling back on those. So use Africa's resources to deal with African development. Secondly is partnership with others to support and accompany Africa's development, because this is a country that is still developing, and it does need those partnerships with the rest of the world. If they succeed elsewhere and Africa fails, the world loses. So how do we secure ODA? Official development assistance has shown resilience. When we had the financial crisis in 2008, it did not diminish as was projected. And I'm confident that donors who still support Africa will continue to do so. I also think that all the issues around debt and all the advocacy that have been made towards that need to be sustained and expanded, not just in terms of debt moratorium, but in terms of debt relief and cancellation, and UNDP working with others to establish this. And I think thirdly on financing is innovative financing and social impact financing. I think it's important the private sector is pulled in, and the instruments that private sector uses can be applied in the public sector as well, looking at how we tap into innovative finance and social entrepreneurship, bonds, green bonds as well, bouncing back with a climate conscious mind, looking at financing in renewable energies, and all of those would open up new doors. So let me stop it there, Ada. I'm happy to develop some of these a little bit further. But just to say that UNDP's approach, as the administrator said, is that we must invest in a back to better agenda. Over.
I'm sure all of our audience have a lot of questions on back to better. I hear e-governance, I hear focus on securing ODA, innovative and social impact financing. We could talk all day, Ms. Ahunna, about this, and a topic that interests me, and as well as all the panelists here. Thank you so much. Our third speaker, Henry Adigun, is a longtime friend and colleague. He is the team leader of Facility for Oil Sector Transformation, an extractive industry support activity funded by UK Aid in Nigeria. Henry is also a firm believer in Nigeria. He applies humor and compassion as he writes well-penned pieces on the state of governance and Nigeria's limitless possibilities. Thank you for your time, my friend. I have 3 questions for you within your limited time. The first is, we want to get a sense of how your oil sector project is adapting. Please speak briefly on how both crises, COVID-19, and the crashing oil prices can be a blessing in disguise for government and the private sector and the citizens. Second question, speaking of opportunities in the development sector, can you please share how you made the transition from the private sector as a banker into the international development sector? And the third question I have is, how can new entrants and veterans prepare for the fast-paced changes currently taking place in this sector? Thank you, Henry.
Thank you, Ada. Very fascinating questions. The oil sector is in a crisis as it is today. Nigeria depends on it for too much of its earnings. We have had cuts on our benchmark. We've had cuts on our budgets. We've had cuts in so many areas. The problem about Nigeria is that we always waste a crisis. This is the 5th crisis of oil in the last 18 years, and we never utilize it properly. We never do the right things when we ought to, and we also get into this crisis again. The only person who seemed to have understood the need to do something was maybe Obasanjo in some parts when he did some work around some escrow accounts, and probably Jonathan with NSI. But other leaders have not seen the virtue of saving for the rainy day. When we were having oil at prices above $100, we didn't save. When we had benchmarks at 57, 55, we didn't save. So now we have no savings, and now we're in a very terrible state. But again, this is the opportunity to do some good changes. How can this be beneficial to Nigeria? First, we can some good things have happened in the last few months, which wouldn't have happened if oil prices had remained high. The first one is this management of subsidies. Over the last 17, 18 years, we spent trillions of naira on subsidies. Subsidies on petrol that do not benefit the poor, that benefit the rich and the middle income, that have no benefits on the real economy. Subsidies on things, on a petrol that is not transparently managed, on imports and other things. In short, we created an economy for others and mortgage the future of ours. So now the government has said there'll be no more subsidies. Now they have said that, but they haven't done enough on that. They've said going forward, this is reduced. But we haven't seen the impact on policy changes, on national cancellations and such. But this is something we've been promised. We hope it's held on to, and we hope it's implemented properly. And we hope that it never comes back again. I'm not anti-subsidies. I mean, I would rather we subsidize agriculture, but I think you subsidize what benefits people, not what is taking in people's future and the present. Second thing is we've heard about the Orosanye report. I mean, a country that earns revenue from selling crude, I mean, not even all processing, that spends 70 cents of every dollar on paying salaries, can't progress and can't move forward. All governments have come to create more agencies. I've added more to the current expenditure. I was reading some financing on some corporations of government in oil, paying upfront of billions in naira in a country that's suffering. You have agencies and head of agencies in Nigeria that earn up to 80 million naira annually. You have agencies that earn 79 million naira annually that don't contribute to anything. You have an NNPC having 6,148 staff, hiring additional 1,000 staff. And you ask, who hires more staff in an economy that's depressed? Well, how do you justify hiring in a situation of a $30 barrel of crude? So the Orosanye report is something past due, should have been implemented years ago. It's on the table now, they're talking about it. We've also heard talk about population control. It's a very sensitive issue here. A lot of people do not like Bill Gates because of what he thinks about population, but it's a fact that we must address as a country. You can't have the numbers of people we have on the resources we have. There are two factors. There's putting the resources to work, but there's also the sheer way the numbers bring down our GDP. And the fact that we're not a productive economy and we're still monocultural, monocrop dependent, that brings a lot of issues around it. So these are things that are happening. It's also a time to look at the legislation around the oil and gas sector. We have our data legislation. The PIB has been in the works for 18, 19 years. Every government since 2000 has paid lip service to the PIB. It'll get to the stage where to get to the passage, somebody won't sign. Sometimes there'll be 4 versions. Now this is the time to look at those legislation and think, okay, the future might not be as clear as it was 2 years ago, but you still depend on this oil to diversify your economy. So even for moving from oil to non-oil, you need oil to finance it. All the debts we've incurred will be financed from revenue. And if something brings about 50% of your revenue and about 85% of foreign exchange, you would think it's normal to think about how to improve the quality of yield of that investment and ensuring. So this is the time to do more work on the bills, more work on the fiscal framework, more work on benefits to those communities, more conversations around that. Now for the private sector, the downstream of an oil sector is where you can create jobs. So the GDP contribution of oil is quite low, maybe like 8 to 9%, depending on which numbers you're using. But it's a misnomer because it doesn't contribute much on GDP, but drives GDP to about 65%. Now that means if you wanted to make the economy work better, you think about the downstream, which private sector can participate. So they need laws, they need structure, they need the government to sometimes step out and become a more efficient regulator than what it is right now. Right now, the government dominates the whole business. For almost 3 years, NNPC was only part of that itself is a problem. There was murky, there was no transparency. The volumes are unbelievable. I mean, Nigeria supposedly consumes 54 million liters of oil per day. It's impossible, or petrol per day. It's literally impossible to consume that much. We don't have the facility to store that much. There's a lot of things that are unanswered in that area. So the private sector will participate where there are clear policies, where there are clear inputs, and will create jobs. We could use more value from crude. Instead of being a crude exporting nation, we could be a crude processing nation. We could start thinking of becoming a hub for many products in the oil and gas sector. I mean, it's ironic that we have more gas than we have crude, and we don't still utilize gas. This is a country where we still burn firewood, where we have issues on climate change rising, we have a degradation in the Delta, and yet we still keep on flaring. And the gas is than crude, it can be utilized, it can bring more revenue. I mean, Qatar, some a year or two ago, moved away from crude, moved to gas, and that economy is doing well because that's their focus right now. So until we see the opportunities and we are able to conceptualize actions that allow a coordination of interventions, then we'll still struggle. So that's about the private sector. You also asked about my personal transition into the oil and gas space and in development. Well, you and I worked together on business environments many years ago when I just left UB. And again, I don't think it's much more difficult. I think for anybody who wants to work in development, you have to understand systems are what drives development. You have to understand processes, and you have to understand how policies, regulation can affect poverty and prosperity. And once you have that understanding, then application is not too different. I mean, I started off in education, working with the British Council on the UB project. That was my first entry into development. And again, it wasn't that complicated. It was still the same issues. Again, improving access, improving quality, improving such, same thing with health systems and all systems. So I think anybody coming to the sector to work has to have a systemic understanding and approach to issues. I mean, what we're trying to do with Enable 1 was to improve the business environment and regulatory space as well. So again, systems came to play, government policies, BMO interactions and such. It's the same thing in oil and gas. What we're trying to do is do more advocacy, what we're trying to understanding and support government in terms of drafting policies or implementing policies or strengthening regulatory efficiencies, and most importantly, reduce corruption. I mean, corruption has many faces. Corruption from planned, which is committed, and then corruption by omission, where there are no rules and guidelines, and people are corrupt because they have to make a business. And what you want to do is ease entry into business. So they're not distributed. All of us in development have one goal: to reduce poverty in the world, to ensure that more families can feed. And then your third question was how does people coming into the space adapt into challenging ways? The world will keep on needing support. The world will keep on needing development. And one of the things we learned from COVID was that no country was really prepared. We had thought the American system or the UK system, and many countries had very advanced systems. But that COVID tested everybody. We learned that it wasn't just enough, and that all of us were not as prepared as what to. And like, it was very good. The African governments responded better than we expected. And we had Ebola to learn from. And Ebola learning was transmitted and translated into better responses on COVID. But for anybody coming into the system, you still have to understand the key focus is about strengthening the impact of governance on the people. The people must benefit from governance. It can't be a system where a very small, minute number are taking away all the resources of many, and while many are left in poverty. It has to be a situation whereby people understand either participatory democracy or participatory governance, understand the roles of deep policies and laws, understand the issues around engagement, and have a right and freedom and platforms to engage. So I don't think it changes. Whether we're doing health, whether we're doing education, whether we're doing governance, whether we're doing prosperity, whether we're doing agriculture, climate change, it still follows the same process and move. That for me is a key learning. I think I'll stop there.
Awesome, thank you, Henry. Excellent point. So if you're wondering about how to get into development as a non-African or an African in diaspora, You should pay close attention to our last speaker, Kevin Conroy, who was my boss when I worked on another UK-aid business environment reform project in Nigeria. Currently, Kevin is the team leader of GROW, an agribusiness and investment advisory program in Liberia. And he also consults on investment advisory and project development in West Africa. Kevin is also CEO of Bature Brewery and other hospitality startups. I remember when he started his Burukutu business from his house in Abuja, and we were subjected to some interesting tasting sessions. Well, this business has grown into a multi-million naira business. So for me, once a boss, you're always my boss. Welcome, Kevin. I would like you to speak on two questions. The first is how COVID-19 has affected growth activities in Liberia. And the second, how you got into development and why in Africa. Also, what recommendations do you have for someone, African or non-African, that is interested in pursuing a similar career?
Thanks, Ada. I may have had the title, but you were always the boss. So it's good to catch up with you again. And thanks to UNC Chapel Hill and iDev-Africa for letting me be part of this panel. I realize that we might be a bit pushed for time, so I'll quickly go through the first question and then, because it's very similar to what Larry was saying at the beginning, and then jump into the second point. So how is our program in Liberia affected by COVID-19? And I'd like to start off saying there is really two external factors, and I'm sure anyone who's a practitioner here, and I'm sure anyone who's a student who might want to look at this in the future, there was two factors that influenced us outside the program, which was the funder and donor response, and secondly, the national pandemic response. So on the funder side, we've seen many programs that were being asked to change their activities and focus in on COVID. On the other side, we've seen some funders actually redirect spending away from programs into healthcare programs. So if you're working in economics or market systems, there's definitely a pressure there to move away and divert spending. And thirdly, some programs were just having funding cut because there was unsurety. No one was quite sure what was going to happen with COVID. Should the funds be held back till next year, or should they be brought into the home countries, the domestic countries where the funds are coming from? These things were definitely on our mind as a program. And then we looked towards like the national pandemic response, and lockdowns and curfews have very different effects, and they're implemented very differently in different countries. So looking at those effects on business and on development was one thing we had to do. Secondly, I think ultimately government's focus and control of the COVID-19 agenda was really important, because the government's response, essentially, if they had control of the agenda, it allowed programs to make more effective contribution and very clear directions on who should do what and when. Where there wasn't much control from government, I think it ended up in such a kind of muddled mess, with either certain programs competing for relevancy and advisory roles, or relevancy and influence, and trying to justify their existence. Or secondly, paralysis, where they were waiting for government to give them a permit or tell them what to do, or they're waiting for direction on could they move around, and that led to a certain paralysis in what they're doing and stepping back from actually implementing. So in our program in GROW, I made a very quick decision with our senior management team that we would rather be relevant than sit out this phase. We'd rather be part of the fight against coronavirus than sit and wait for directions. So that was the first thing we did, was look at our approach. And we are an agribusiness, agri-investment advisory program that really focuses on market systems change and working with the private sector. So we really believe that we have a unique view that is around keeping business moving, keeping investment going, and looking at the economic impact of COVID-19. That's where we could work with local businesses, work with local advisors, work with potential investors, and say, what do we need to change? What do we need to do to make sure business continues despite COVID? We didn't take a humanitarian response, and in many cases, we would try and work to limit a humanitarian response and look more at a health and economic response. We would say that we do believe the long-term effect of COVID is going to be the economy. The immediate and, of course, very much important response is on the healthcare. But the longer-term impact on lives, on the youth, on employment, on opportunity, on incomes, will be the economic impact. So as a program, the first thing that we said is that we need to keep moving. The first thing we did was adopt our operations. So we moved our implementation team onto online software tools such as Asana, Slack, and Teams. That allowed us to keep communicating, keep working from home, keep collaborating on Excel or Microsoft Word or whatever software you use throughout the crisis. And we had to also, up our bandwidth and data packs for all our teams, so we should keep connected. Secondly was getting all those passes that were required from government to keep ourselves operating. So if we did have to go and meet someone, of course respecting social distance, but if we had to go and meet a minister or meet a civil servant, that we had the passes to do that. So the very first thing was implement an operational plan to work around COVID, and also do that in a preventative way of enhancing the spread of the virus. The second thing that we felt was important for us was looking at this impact on logistics and transport. We've seen that this is where we had the connections, we had the knowledge, and we could do research. And for us, it really is the biggest thing that we could do, was to advise the government on how to mitigate the impacts of curfews and lockdowns on things like transport, logistics, market access for people who want to buy food, on how to keep companies moving. That's companies from healthcare products to packaging of goods to food processing. If you don't keep these things moving, your economy would drive to a halt. And that's when you would start to see things like food crisis, health crisis kicking in, because people wouldn't have access to the goods they need. But outside of working with the government, we also wanted to work with firms directly. We do believe that government has an important role, but ultimately businesses and agencies are, and people like farmers and skilled workers, unskilled workers, they need access to information also. So we built up our COVID-19 information pack tailored towards each of these individual groups that says, if you're going to continue your business, then this is how you should be doing it in a COVID-friendly way. Now, this material is continually being reviewed, being reissued in light of guidance from WHO, but our objective as ours is to, as we move into planting season, is to use our network of farmers across Liberia to ensure that they have information on how to continue farming activities safely in a way that doesn't spread coronavirus. And through that, not working with government, we still think we're having a positive impact on these beneficiaries. And then thirdly, we wanted to kind of adapt our delivery. And Larry mentioned this earlier. It's not just about telling people what to do, but what do you do yourselves? So, for example, we do a lot of work in cocoa. The cocoa sector is a huge opportunity in Liberia for fine flavor, excellent quality cocoa, and organic, pesticide-free. But the idea that we work with farmers on training them on the process of organic certification, or we work on improving trade agreements between international buyers and farmers, is really difficult when you can't be in the same room. So on the one hand, we're changing our program from more face-to-face interaction between international buyers and exporters and farmers with more remote video conferencing services, or doing some kind of training on farmers on how to become and access the digital tools that are available to keep their communication with potential buyers alive during this time of separation and restrictions on travel. Secondly, we are also adapting our methods of training. So we have new protocols for going into the field, such as using PPE, staying a distance away from potential people we're working with. And if we do have to do training, doing it in much smaller groups and out in the open. So these are just some of the changes that programs are facing as they adapt to COVID-19. Now, I'll jump straight into working in development, whether you're from Africa or whether you're from outside or whether you're in diaspora. Larry said at the beginning, he's really looking for people that are young, highly motivated, smart people. I think that's great. I think I would never qualify to work with TechnoServe, but I think companies like that do offer great opportunities. So first of all, map out the implementers like TechnoServe, like Smith International, like Palladium. They are there and they offer very good recruitment processes for looking at what jobs are available. I would love to say that my plan was always to travel to Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria when I was young, and that I was, looking for an exciting place to work because I really appreciate the countries. But the truth is, I was looking for a job that allowed me to travel almost anywhere, and I wanted to do it as part of life-building experience. And I never knew I would be based out of West Africa for 12, 13 years after that. My first role kind of in development was in Afghanistan, going in as a researcher and an analyst. So the opportunity to work in Nigeria was actually a great step up in terms of safety and security. I'm also pretty against some of the traditional ways of doing development. I think poorly designed subsidies end up leading to inefficiency. And I think that market interference by donors, such as subsidizing markets or giving away free equipment or free vehicles or even free healthcare, can really undermine local entrepreneurs and not actually lend itself to a system that's resilient and can be built up over time. So I kind of come from that philosophy of thinking. And I can believe that development can only really be led and achieved by national governments. So whether that's in Liberia or Nigeria, they have to control the agenda and get into the habit of saying, right, this is where we want to go. And aid coming from foreign aid agencies should be channeling into their national direction or national pathway with all seriousness. I really see private sector investment and economic reform is where we should be focusing our efforts, because as other speakers have said, huge opportunity, huge promise in West Africa. And I'm want to be part of that. And that's why I put my investments there. That's why I started businesses there, because I think there's a huge opportunity for growth, for income, and that's what's really exciting. And we may use phrases like development, but generally economic growth, opportunities to grow businesses, different sectors emerging, new products, new flavors, new crops that are now in international demand, great quality cocoa, is all really exciting to be there, but it requires private sector investment and growth. And that's where I'd like to channel my efforts. And I think there will be more opportunities in those sectors for other people wanting to come in. So I'd urge people to look in that direction. I would say finally, if you're really interested in getting into development needs more economists, it needs more business-minded people, needs more investment advisors, needs more entrepreneurs, needs tech-smart people. They need these types of skills. So while you may be looking at maybe doing a course on international development or looking at development studies, I think that's great, but try and partner up with something, with another skill that is needed in terms of implementation. So that could be agronomy, it could be looking at economic modeling, it could be looking at business advisory skills, but having those dual traits, having those dual skills is really beneficial.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Kevin. I promised I was going to end this at 11, but I cannot end this without asking a few questions. I'd like to go straight to Ms. Ahunna Eziakonwa. There's been a lot of questions around if you could explain a little bit of what back to better strategy is. And pretty much, I think most people are interested in what that means and if there are activities currently ongoing and how they can tap into those interventions.
Right, thank you. Basically, with the Back to Better agenda, we're saying normal was not what's wrong. Normal was a world that was unequal, a world that was unsustainable, and a world without resilience. So building back better, stronger, and greener is obviously fostering actually what we always said in the Sustainable Development Goals, but had no chance and no will to implement the letter. So bringing that agenda back on the table and trying to understand, first of all, someone talked about governance. We totally believe that this is critical. It means that we need to build a new social contract between states and society. We need to reimagine the state in Africa. It has to be one that has integrity. It has to be one where justice can be fully deployed. It has to be a state that really cares for its people and it's able to deliver services, public goods. So Back to Better, first is to consider things like health as a public good, a service like education as a public good, and therefore you don't ignore them and put the least amount of money in your budget for these sectors. You have to actually invest heavily in the social sectors and in human capital development. So our program with countries right now about looking at how to build a much more capable African state to deliver those public goods to society, and to have the right governance approach. The second is in this area of e-work, e-government, e-commerce, digital finance, now bringing in all the technical people, digital people. We need to equalize education, for instance. We have places today where kids are learning with the worst kind of materials because they're poor and they're living in areas where you cannot get good teachers out there. So how do we deploy digital tools to equalize education? So it doesn't matter where you live, where you're based, where your parents come from, you get the same level of education piped out to you if we have the right digital infrastructure investment. So we want to invite or work with financial institutions, with private sector to make sure Africa expands its broadband infrastructure. And so all of you in this area of information technology, just know that COVID-19 has just confirmed that this is an amazing instrument to foster and accelerate development and to also fight inequality in the services that are provided. And then the third, I think, is how we build back greener. You know, Africa still has very low energy access. I think 60% of the continent of the population has no access to energy. This is not viable and it's not sustainable if we look at Africa as where we have the future of development. Those small and medium enterprises have to be powered. You know, how do we do that through even the digital aid? The digital tools cannot be powered without electricity. So investment in energy access, but particularly leveraging green energy, looking at possibility of renewables. As the brown economy flattens, we need to start investing in the green economy. So again, those working in the area of environmental sustainability, but also particularly in the energy sector, are really invited to reimagine how Africa can power all of Africa using a combination of energy sources, but prioritizing renewables, because that also helps us to protect the environment and build more sustainability and resilience in our economies. And then finally is financing, as I said earlier, that we need to also reimagine the way the African state is financed. We need well-resourced states. So a combination of every country takes a loan, but what is the African loan doing? You know, how are resources distributed on the continent? How are the mobilization that is happening now it's gonna be more needs, less money in the future. The future that we're going into is more needs and less money. So really there's a call to those in the financial sector to really come together and imagine how we're going to resource African countries in the face of this devastation to rebuild. And there are a number of opportunities and options that we could be looking at.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, so I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us because we've come to the end of this webinar. But before we leave, you all agree with me that all the panelists who have spoken deserve at least an hour. So we've tried to packing so much, and like we were just played Greedy Tom here, trying to get everyone to contribute to this conversation. So I really want to appreciate the panelists. Thank you, Ms. Ahunna. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Kevin. General points, you all agree that all our speakers emphasize the importance of technology to new ideas and solutions. So whatever you're thinking about, think about how you can leverage new and existing technology. There is a focus on local mobilization for financing, of course, piggybacking on technology frameworks and infrastructure. Governance has been a resonating theme with all our panelists. And Ms. Eziakonwa has emphasized e-governance, e-work, electronic work, and electronic governance, again, technology. And she ended her Q&A with saying more needs, less money. aid is declining, everyone has to dig deep to see where is the money going to come from and how can Africans be responsible for Africans' development, in summary. So thank you, everybody. We have an interesting lineup of digital content and online dialogues on the way. Please be on the lookout for them. On behalf of the African Studies Center here at UNC Chapel Hill and Odwin Yokonkwo, my iDev partner and friend, I say thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ada. All the best.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.